deal. Now, this invasion may have been going on for the last 80 years. If they're doing 1 million a year in abductions, and these abductees are only being abducted to train the infiltrators, and the abductees are being replaced back in the society each and every night, and only being used to train infiltrators, as I say, then how many infiltrators per year can 1 million people train in the United States? And here's some of the weird things about this, okay? You get individuals like Corey Good saying, oh, there's millions of abductions a year and most of them never come back. Well, that's a bogus statement, right? Okay, and it also is a diverting statement, because from that point on, you as the listener are not going to think appropriately about the abductions. You're going to go off on, well, he's full of it, blah, 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 right? And so you're not going to think about appropriately about the abduction phenomenon that is actually occurring right now. And all of the common thread, the hugest common thread of the whole thing is that these abductees are training infiltrators. They're training quasi-humans, the third generation humanoid hybrids, to infiltrate and live in our society. And I've had some over the years, I've had some instances, okay, where there were just strange things being reported to me, and I didn't know what to make of them, that I'm now of the opinion were perhaps participatory in this. Okay, and one of them was a situation where there was this guy in Germany that had this very curious tale to tell me in the year 2007. And he rented a apartment. He owned a bunch of apartments. That was his job. He rented and managed his apartments. And he was, I think, in his 30s then. This was like 2006, 2007, something like that. And he rented out a top floor, which was 2 apartments, to an individual that paid him 3 times what it was worth to rent these things for 3 months only. Now, the guy who owned the apartment building didn't like anything less than year-long leases. He wanted very stable tenants and so on. And so he was not inclined to listen to these people that came and told him that they wanted to rent the top 2 apartments on this building. And he said, well, they finally said to him, well, we'll give you 3 times the amount of money, basically a whole year's worth of money. And we're only going to be there for 90 days, and you can go ahead and rent it out again. And he agreed. He said, you know, against his better judgment, he found himself in agreement. They wrote him out a check. He has vivid memories of going and depositing the check and receiving his statement and everything. And he's telling me this from the perspective of the day after the 90 days had elapsed. And he was saying that everybody in the apartment building told him that those apartments had been empty for the last 3 months. And he's shocked. They were asking him, the other tenants in the apartment building were asking him, well, when are you going to rent those? And he said, well, they are rented. And they said, no, nobody's been there for the last 3 months. And he goes on up and looks in the apartment, and indeed there had been people up there. You could tell. He said there was just the weirdest collection of trash and stuff you'd ever seen in your life. And it cost him some time and energy to clear it out. He also talked about how everybody in the apartment building, because he was so flummoxed, he went and queried them all, and nobody had seen anybody there. Yet the electricity had been on the whole time. He had the electrical power usage bill. He had water use bill, and even sewer. There was some other aspects about the sewer too that were quite unusual, about the sewage levels and stuff. But anyway, the curious part of this was the money wasn't there. Okay, so he went to his bank and he said, well, I know I rent, took him a number of days. And he sort of told me that he felt like he was coming out of a huge mental fog. And finally he went to his bank and he was going to take some of the money out from that payment for the cleanup, and the money wasn't there. And when he queried his bank, no, he'd never made that deposit, but he knew explicitly what day he'd put that money in. And so he goes back to his apartment, not in that building, and to retrieve the deposit slip that was given by the teller at the time he deposited it. And it was an advert. It was just a little tiny advert, the same size as the deposit slip. And he said the curious part of it was he's flipping through his little Filofax kind of thing for these paper receipts, goes to that month, reaches in and pulls up the group, and looks at it, and he sees the bank's name on that piece of paper fading away. And then he retrieves the piece of paper, and it's a 3-month-old advert for a local business, like you might get in, Dollar Savers or Every Wednesday kind of thing, right? So he had no money. He had a trashed apartment. He had an apartment he had to pay bucks for. And then the thing that finally prompted him to get hold of me, he heard my woo-woo stuff on various different forums online, and he got hold of me and wrote me this email. We had a series of email exchanges, but what finally prompted him to all of this was about a week after he had discovered himself coming out of the fog, the day after the people had moved out. About a week later, he was visited by what he presumed was people from the US military. They didn't identify themselves as such. He kind of saw the military bearing. They were clearly Americans, speaking very quality German, but nonetheless had an American accent, and asked him a series of questions about his visitors, but he really couldn't recall anything. And the interview lasted like 30 minutes or so, less than that, and they went away. And so he wonders basically what the hell happened to him, what the hell happened to his apartments, what the hell happened to the money. And I now think that what happened was that he had rented his apartments to these space aliens, and that these space aliens just put into his head that what he had was a check, and that he had gone to the bank and deposited it. It never existed. He never went to the bank. He never talked to the tellers. He never made any deposits that day. But because he was such a methodical fellow, he wrote down in his ledger the amount of money, what day it was, the fictitious name he was given, and all of this kind of stuff, only to discover later that it was all built around some kind of delusion. And this guy is not the delusional kind of fellows. So I think that kind of thing is going on all over at the moment, that there's not scouting parties per se, but like integration expeditions where they come to inoculate and get the hybrids used to living among humans. And these hybrids and their security force have the ability to screw with our heads and wipe our brains and all of this kind of thing. Now, a lot of this is going to sound very much like all the other weird woo-woo kind of stuff, right? But I actually have statistical correlations that we could say are evidence that this is going on. And I also have statistical absences that are hugely glaring, because nobody worldwide in the woo-woo community discusses abductions to the level that it should be discussed relative to the number of people that are reporting abductions. It is as though we're seeing 50 million UFOs a year relative to the amount of verbiage about UFOs. And we're only having 100 abductions a year relative to the amount of verbiage about abductions.
Man, that's a great point. And I remember back in the early 90s, it was the abduction phenomena was being talked about a lot more. And I remember there was even a TV show that was like a talk show, and they were having guests on, and they were discussing over 1 million abductions a year. And then it just kind of disappeared. And then people, like, oh man, I would rather watch. Now people would rather watch somebody leave a tweet about the size of an actress's butt versus
right.
Man, did you see that? And she's eating steak at the same time.
Right.
So it's interesting how, that was talked about. And, I think I can't even think of a better time to do this show, because the Bob Lazar interview that just came out, and he was talking about this anti-gravity propulsion systems and these craft that they uncovered. I'm wondering if these beings that are now infiltrating, if that's their craft, and they're like, we want it back. Or another thing is, like, if they look just like us, they could be in the White House. They could be in any agency. They could be our next door neighbor. They could be anybody. You wouldn't.
There you go. That's the invaders scenario, or pod people, whatever the name of that movie was, right? Donald Sutherland was in the remake. No, that's exactly the case, dude, is that they're using our own genome to make replicants. Now, there's a whole lot about this stuff. I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I've done some serious drill down in various different aspects of it. I even have the beginnings of a strategic war plan, how to combat these guys, things that we can do in our advantage that maybe the military isn't thinking about because they're not particularly looking at things in an appropriate way, in my viewpoint. We have tools that we can use. It's not doomed. I mean, we're not doomed necessarily, right? If we become aware of what's going on and we act in the appropriate fashion individually, if we act in the appropriate fashion, the combined network effect, in my opinion, will lead to our, we have at least a 50-50 chance of succeeding. However, one thing we have to acknowledge is that this may have been going on for like the last 1,000 years. So here's some historical background stuff, right? There are patterns in literature and language that are 1,000 years old, that go back to in the 900s in Europe and also in Asia, primarily in China. There are patterns in the language of what was being written then that suggest that that era also had the same kind of thing we have here, which is an escalation of the number of abductions and in a build out of strangeness in the abductions in the form of hybridization. So it should come as no surprise, but a lot of people will be surprised, I think, to note that we can find literature that is in the 1068, 1102, these kind of years, and we can find literatures in which they will talk about being abducted, forced to have sex with an alien in order to produce a hybrid, and how the monsters were not doing well. The hybrids were not doing well. But at that point, and it continued on, and the literature ramped up along with the explosion of the populations after the Great Plagues. And as the populations grew, the number of abductions grew, the integration of the abduction phenomenon into our society. So for instance, it may have been the abduction escalation in the 1100s through the 1300s that led to the Inquisition. Okay, it was part of the abduction phenomenon in the 1100s through the 1284 in the Children's Crusade. You know the old story of Pied Piper, okay, Hamelin, the little village in Germany. It's got rats, and this guy comes along and he's going to get rid of all of the rats for the Germans, or for the people in Hamelin, and he does his magic with the flute. All the rats follow him down to the river and they all drown. He had previously agreed on a specific amount of money that he wanted from that village for doing this task. When he was done with it, they said, ha ha, all the rats are dead. We're not going to pay you. We're going to Welsh. And he said, well, okay. And he goes off. And 3 weeks later, something like that, he comes back and he does his little flute thing, and several hundred children follow him out of the village, never to be seen again. Now, this is a plaque in Hamelin, Germany, you know, like a big bronze plaque that tells this story. I've seen it. And this plaque was about an incident in 1282, I think it was, or 1284, about around in that period. And they record 182 children disappearing. So mass abduction, okay? Those 182 children are, if you investigate this further, you'll find that the academics will tell you they were most likely abducted by local bandits and sold into the Children's Crusades. Okay, the Children's Crusades were this thing that was organized by the Roman Catholic Church to get children from all over and sell them into slavery in the Mideast. And they sold the idea of children to children all throughout Europe, that only you can come on down and join into this great crusade to change humanity and liberate the relics of Christ from the Holy Land. And there's not going to be any wars or anything. You just have to come on down, and just your mere presence in mass will cause this to occur. And they had giant collection points in Italy and Greece and all over Southern Europe, where they put these kids onto boats, never to be seen again, as they were sold into slavery in the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. That's presumably what had happened. But the amount of people that disappeared was tremendous relative to the society itself. So out of the city of Hamelin, 1 out of 3 children was gone. So imagine if 30% of all the children out of New York were to just go like that. Okay, it made that kind of an impact on what was going on. The things going on with the Inquisition, though, the Inquisition was a response to alien invasions and the stories of the alien abductions, and the stories of the abductions getting out into the regular populace and aggregating non-church power. And it has to do with a complex response to alien abductions that swept through Central Europe at that time, from about the mid 900s up until the 1400s. Now, we need to note something here, that right now we're at the doorstep of a grand solar minimum. There was a previous grand solar minimum in 1640 period of time. Abductions waned, they peaked and then waned with the grand solar minimum coming in. So there may have been something about that minimum that caused the abductions to go down. It also occurred in a previous solar minimum, not quite a grand minimum, in the 1400s, where the amount of language relative to the phenomenon of what we term abductions went way down. And it persisted as long as the cold weather persisted. So I don't know what the link is there, but it's correlated. And so I think we should examine it. But go ahead.